Wireless LAN Weekly, Episode 30, Joe Epstein on Mobile IP.
Welcome to Wireless LAN Weekly, a podcast focused on the wireless networking professional. We aim to educate, inform, entertain, and inspire. Get ready to listen and enjoy. Now to our host of the show, Keith Parsons.
Welcome back to Wireless LAN Weekly. This is episode 30, and I'm your host, Keith Parsons. Today is the result of a couple episodes ago. I made a big mistake. I was trying to set up the equipment for a recording, and I recorded Joe Epstein, and we were talking about his book on mobile IP. And because of some technical difficulties, we weren't able to get that interview to come live. I have since recorded that interview, and today's episode is Joe Epstein of Meru Networks talking about his book on mobile IP. We discuss a variety of things on mobile IP, some pieces of information you need to know, and Joe goes into some detail about not only voice over IP as well as 802.11 and some of the things to look for in the future with 802.11n, and even onto FMC, fixed mobile convergence, as we get cell phones and voice over IP phones working together. So, hope you enjoy the show with Joe Epstein and mobile IP. Now on with the show.
Interesting facts, little-known tidbits, things you might not have known, short little bits to set your mind a-reeling.
Interesting fact. This is Keith Parsons, and this week I was able to present and attend other sessions at the SharkFest conference at Stanford University, talking about different Wireshark issues. And one of the presenters there was Joe Bardwell. And Joe talked about something that he's mentioned as an interesting fact, so I'm just going to forward what he had mentioned as well. And it's the reason behind 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz waves not traveling as far. Now, actually, they physically travel just as far as each other. It's an electromagnetic wave, and it continues to travel on. If you waited long enough, it would get all the way out to the Andromeda Galaxy. But at the same RSSI, or received signal strength, 2.4 gig waves arrive at the same distance away from an access point louder than do 5 gigahertz waves. And it's not anything to do with the actual wave itself, degrading or attenuating more. The difference is in the aperture size of the receiving antenna. The receive antennas are built to a specific size based on the frequency you're trying to listen in on. 5 gigahertz waves are smaller than 2.4 gigahertz waves, so 5 gigahertz antennas are also smaller than 2.4 gigahertz antennas. Thus, the smaller size antenna has a smaller aperture, and it catches or receives a smaller amount of the signal that's being sent. So the distance difference between 2.4 and 5 gigahertz is not based on anything other than flat-out size. Antennas are smaller, and they collect smaller amount of information, smaller amount of energy that's coming in.
Things every wireless LAN professional needs to know. Gear up, buckle down, and stand by for the real techie stuff.
Hello, in this episode we finally get Joe Epstein back. Sorry for the technical difficulty on the previous episode, but we've got him back and talking with us today. Joe Epstein is the Senior Director of Technology at Meru. In addition, he's also in charge of the Voice over Wi-Fi Task Group with the Wi-Fi Alliance. And for our discussion today, obviously he's the author, and the book we'll be talking about is Scalable Voice over IP Mobility, Integration and Deployment. Nice long title. What made you come up with such a long title, Joe?
Well, my original title was going to be even longer. I had originally thought of giving it a subtitle like How to Walk, Talk, and Chew Gum with Wireless, but the editor didn't like that. The real point here was to capture that it is about VoIP mobility. The rest of this stuff is interesting because, certainly when you start talking about voice over IP, and especially wireless voice over IP or voice over Wi-Fi, you really get into the area of scalability. And so I definitely wanted that in the title. And then integration and deployment is just to give context on what the book's about.
And it's a very descriptive title as well. Kind of hard to say, but other than that, it's a great book. I wrote up my review in the last episode, but let's talk to you about it a little bit. In the book, you cover both the voice over IP side and the wireless side, and then how they all combine together. Why did you start with the normal wired voice over IP?
Well, in order to understand where doing mobile voice over IP is different, you have to get the basics down. And so I thought it was crucial to really get into what voice over IP is and lay it out, not just bits and bytes and things, but lay out the concepts. In this case, I wanted to lay out that first there is this idea of signaling versus bearer. And then I wanted to dive into, okay, so what makes voice quality bad or what makes it good? And then once you begin to understand what makes it good, you can kind of roll forward to the application of the technologies over wireless. It's important to note that Wi-Fi is always, when it was designed and the way the standard's written, it was thought of as an extension of a wireline network. Now, as we know, and as the book goes to show, there's a big difference as soon as you remove the copper and you start going over the air. But from a protocol level, there is this integration part, and so it's worth understanding, okay, here's how this stuff was intended to work over wires, and then now let's see what it does when you get wireless.
I think it's a very valid way to go about it. And then you go into 802.11, and I think your couple chapters there in 802.11 and some of the best ones I've read on covering the basics, the things you have to know. So what are the key points there that someone should have as a takeaway from those chapters?
From the wireless chapters, I really was interested in having people understand and just laying out, one, how do wireless networks come together? So it's a mixture of understanding that it is, in fact, unlicensed spectrum. So what is this unlicensed spectrum? What does it mean? Then adding on to that the idea, okay, now that you have unlicensed spectrum, you have devices, how does the standard use it? How do these technologies take advantage of it? Then some ideas of architectures. I really wanted people to come away understanding overall that wireless is understandable. It is a manageable thing, but it's very different than wires. And the details that I go into and the points that I'm trying to highlight about how the physical layer works, or the notions of that it's essentially a hub-based network rather than a switch-based network, and you have old contention issues that long since went away on the wireline side. I wanted that to really stand out so that people understood exactly that it isn't just a switch that happens for an over-the-air. There's something else different to it. And hopefully if you read those chapters, you get a good sense of it.
Well, I think you do a great job of covering that. That whole contention issue is really the big bugaboo that everyone runs across. It's easy to get signal places, just add more power, more antennas, but it's how do you get them so they can play nice together?
Right. No, I definitely agree. And, you know, especially contention when it comes to voice is probably the most important thing you want to know once you get everything set up. So obviously there's some complexity in setting up a voice over wireless network and some expertise required. But once you get there, one of the big determining factors on how well it's going to work is what happens with contention. And that's not just because Wi-Fi is contention-based. It's also because the way quality of service works over Wi-Fi takes advantage or changes the way the contention is, making contention really step to the forefront as a critical factor.
Well, you brought up contention. Actually, that was going to be QoS was going to be my very next question. So what is different about wireless QoS compared to what we're used to on switches?
The main thing is that it's non-deterministic. And what do I mean by that? When you look at wireless quality of service, it's not just about having the ability to say all my voice traffic goes before all my data traffic. That's something that you can do on wired networks, on switches, very simply because you have all the traffic in front of you. But on a wireless network, the traffic is coming in from multiple injection points. It's not just on a cable or into a switch backplane or something where you can deal with it. It's really flying through the air. Every device generates something. And so in order to deal with that, there's something called WMM, or Wi-Fi Multimedia. It's based off of the IEEE 802.11e standard, but it's a little bit different. What it's doing is saying that there are going to be 4 classes of traffic. There's going to be the usual data traffic that we all know about, and that's going to be called best effort, which really says the point. Then there's going to be video traffic, which has a higher probabilistic priority. I'll get into that. Then voice traffic is the highest, and background traffic is the lowest. Of course, it's important to note that all 4 of these categories are really best effort from a quality of service perspective. They're just prioritized differently. What do I mean by prioritized differently? The key piece here is that if voice traffic has a better chance, any given voice packet has a better chance of getting on the air when it's busy than any given data packet. And the idea there is, if you think of contention-based mechanisms, and we look at, Ethernet-based hubs or CSMA CD, meaning that was carrier sense multiple access, but with collision detection. So if 2 devices transmitted at the same time, it could detect and stop that. Over the air, you do not have that ability. If two devices transmit, they collide, and both the transmissions are just lost, and the time it takes to send it is also lost. Because of that particular piece, when you try to transmit for voice, what they do is they take the back off level. So there's this, I know I'm going through a lot of concepts. When you back off, when a device backs off, what it does is it says, aha, I have a packet I need to send. Because it's CSMA CA, collision avoidance rather than collision detection, it can't tell if a collision is going to happen or is happening, but it can tell if the air is busy. So it first senses the air and says, is it busy or not? If somebody else is transmitting, well, why transmit and cause a collision? I might as well keep on listening until that transmission is done, and then I take my turn. So it first waits till the air is clear. Once the air is clear, it waits a minimum amount of time. There's a name for this minimum amount of time, and it depends on the type of packet. It's called an arbitration interframe spacing, or AIFS. After that passes, it now picks a random number. It picks a random number between 0 and some specified value. This is where the quality of service comes in a big way. For voice packets, it picks a number between usually 0 and 3. With data packets, typical best efforts between 0 and 15. Now, what does this do? When you pick less numbers, then obviously the average number that you pick is low. That random number translates into the amount of slots you wait, by the way, in order to transmit, a slot being a 9 microsecond interval. So if a voice device rolls between 0 and 3, it rolls its 4-sided die and it picks the number 2, say. That means it'll count 0, 1, 2 slots, and if the air's been clean for those 2 slots, or those 3 slots, it will then transmit. A data packet could also pick 2 or 1. But the odds are, because it's rolling a 16-sided die, it's probably going to pick a number closer to 6, or essentially 6 slots to wait. That means that voice gets to usually go through faster. And I'm ignoring the AIFS differences, which can matter, but sometimes don't. Overall, that's good. The problem with this probabilistic quality of service model, well, there are 2 pieces. One, a little bit of voice and a lot of data can still cause issues for both voice and data. But even more interesting is a lot of voice. Well, what do you do if your network is busy? Every device always has something it wants to send. If the whole system of arbitrating access to the air, this whole contingent-based scheme, is essentially I'm going to roll this 4-sided die, well, what do you do when you have 5 devices? If you have 5 devices all wanting to transmit at the same time, and there are 5 voice devices, well, no matter how you do it, one of them is going to pick the same number as another, which means you're guaranteed to have a collision. The good news with voice is that voice, you're not always going to get 5 devices who want to transmit at the same time. You have to get up to some solid density to get there. And the reason why is even if you have 5 phones that are all talking at the same time, the odds are pretty good if they're just 5 phones doing nothing but voice, and that's the whole thing running on the air. Phones talk every 20 milliseconds. They usually send a packet upstream every 20 milliseconds, and that's part of the voice call. If you have 4 phone calls running at the same time, or 5 phone calls running at the same time, and that's it, the odds are pretty low that any 2 of them are going to want to transmit at exactly the same time. Because across that 20 millisecond window, you can divide it up into 5 pretty easily. The odds are pretty good that they're not going to overlap. Where this matters is once you have a lot of data on the air and enough voice, the data removes the ability for voice to have these degrees of freedom so it can transmit where it wants to. It really focuses it down. And if your air is always busy with data, then the little opportunities that voice has to transmit, you may start to see this contention between voice and other voice clients just because they have limited opportunities to access. They're all going to want to access at the same time then because they've all waited in order to get the air to be clean. That's where you begin to see this quality of service really become into play.
And so recommendation on the mixing of voice and data on the same frequency? Is that one way to solve the problem?
Yeah, so basically I'm highlighting that if you have a lot of voice and some data, then this really gets impacted. Or if you have some voice and a lot of data, this happens. But if you have a lot of voice and just that's it, you still could see this problem. One of the things that always makes me bristle is when somebody says, well, you should run your voice on a different network than run your data. Because although that does avoid this particular problem, that's twice the gear. You're asking for somebody to put out twice the number of devices than they normally would, twice the number of access points, twice the number of whatever. That bothers me. I don't think that that's exactly the right way to go, but I do think it is important to be cognizant of these issues in quality of service and to really understand that this is a non-deterministic medium, that this is really contention happening, and you need to kind of wrap your mind around what does this mean when you scale up your network. a takeaway for bigger results, what that essentially means is if you're going to build out your network, you want to understand really what your devices are doing. You want to read the manuals, you want to read the things that come out, the design guides that come out from the vendors, so you get a very good sense on where devices are going to do well and where devices are going to contend and where devices are going to have quality issues. And then you have to make sure you try this out and watch it. You have to monitor these things. It's very crucial, and I mentioned a number of times in my book, you really want to know what your voice quality of your network really is. The more you know, the better off you'll understand that network. As
an example, what if you ran voice over IP over hubs? Would that give you a fairly decent analog to running over wireless? Not that people do it that way, but...
Yeah. Conceptually, that's what I'm talking about, yes. Conceptually, it's imagine running voice over IP over hubs. That's really the issue with when you're thinking about running voice over wireless.
Well, as part of the Wi-Fi LANs on the VoFi, what's coming down the pike for us to look forward to there? Obviously, you've been having lots of meetings and thinking and writing documents. What can we expect?
Sure, and there's actually a lot of public information available for everybody to look at. I think that's crucial because the more information you know about where the standards are going, the better. There are a few concepts that you really want to know, and this is even broader than the Wi-Fi Alliance. This is just at a conceptual level. How do I manage voice networks? The first thing that's important is this concept of admission control. There are two flavors. Vendors have proprietary admission control mechanisms, and then there's a standard, again based on 11E, of doing admission control within a Wi-Fi perspective. The idea of admission control is actually pretty simple. What I said to you is basically true, which it is. You assume that, if you put too much voice on the network or mix voice and data in the wrong way, that you're going to have quality problems with voice. There's a maximum capacity. There's a maximum number of voice calls, and maybe it's not 5. Maybe it's based on the usage. It's 10 or 15, or maybe if you got a good system, it could be 20, 30, 40. These numbers can go all over the place, but there is some maximum capacity, and what you don't want to do is exceed that maximum capacity. You don't want to have too many voice calls going, because if you have too many voice calls going and quality begins to happen from contention or lack of capacity issues, it tends to distribute across all the voice calls, and so everybody's call suffers. The idea of admission control is to simply say that the system needs to detect or understand that a voice call is coming. And if a voice call is coming, is being placed, and there just isn't room for it, you want to send a busy signal to the phone. The idea there is the network protects its investments. It already has phone calls going that it doesn't want to disrupt. So it's better to send a busy signal to the new guy and have him just understand that there's no availability than have him come on to and ruin it for everybody. Admission control, again, today you can do it in a proprietary manner, and many vendors do this, by the way. They look at in my book I describe pretty clearly what the signaling protocols are. SIP is a great example of a signaling protocol. They intercept the SIP messages going across the network through the air, in fact, because this is wireless devices doing this. And when they detect that there's a phone call, they can look into the SIP, determine what the resources are going to be, and give a yes or no decision on whether to add it. Coming from the standards bodies and groups like the Wi-Fi Alliance or technologies that make that even more standardized, so it works across devices that may not use SIP. Instead, every device is responsible for actually registering, kind of like RSVP, but in a wireless sense. It's not using the RSVP protocol itself, but registering their requirements. And when they do register their requirements, they're given a yes or no decision on whether they can get that allocation and then make that phone call.
Is that per phone call or just per device?
Sure. It's per phone call. Every device is responsible for doing it when you have the system enabled, and the network can actually advertise that admission control must be mandatory. But if it's mandatory, every time the device wants to establish a phone call, it's going to send out one of these requests.
And where could you go find more information on this up-and-coming protocol?
There are a number of places to get a good basic understanding. I actually do describe it in my book, so obviously that's one place to look. Other places that can look, you can actually get the IEEE standards online. There's get802.org, I believe, and allows you to download them for free. The problem that you'll have there is that, one, it's incredibly dense, very tough to read. You need to basically have read it for a long time to fully understand what it's saying. And two, what's coming out of the Wi-Fi Alliance is always different than IEEE for the quality of service. It's slightly different because early on, the Wi-Fi Alliance said WMM is the way to go, and WMM is similar to but is not the same as IEEE 802.11e. But you can look there. The Wi-Fi Alliance itself publishes papers. They should be publishing more as time goes on, and so they're always a great resource to look for these sorts of papers. And when you get one of them, they're almost always written at a level where they don't go into such technical detail that they make your eyes roll, but they do lay it out in enough terms that it's not just pure marketing, that you really do understand what the technology is behind it.
Good. Well, we'll put some links in the show notes to point to those places to get some more resources. Another thing that we're faced with here in the wireless LAN professionals, where we have to live with this day in and day out, is moving toward 802.11n. And how is N going to affect, at all, if it does, in voice over IP?
That's a great question. So 802.11n is something that everybody needs to think about now, because if it isn't already hard for you, it will get hard soon for you to get 802.11 ABG devices throughout your network. You may be able to still continually get some ABG devices, but many laptops, many data devices are 11N today. Voice devices are coming with 11N as time goes on, and access points have 11N pretty much now, and that's either an option or essentially what you'll want to be getting. Voice is impacted by 802.11n in a few different ways. The first most obvious way, it's not the most important, but it's the most obvious way, is that you may have voice devices that use 11n chipsets as opposed to 11 ABG chipsets. What that tends to mean is that they then have access to some of the extra features of 802.11n. Bear in mind that an 802.11n access point can work with an 802.11 ABG or legacy handset just fine. There isn't a huge advantage in them switching to 11N on the handset side, but there are some advantages, one of which is it opens up the idea of these 40 megahertz or double wide channels to be used even from a small form factor device. There's a couple of other power safe things that the devices can take advantage of when they're in 11N. Where you really want to understand is actually goes right back to that topic of contention that I mentioned. And it does because 802.11n is a very high throughput concept. It's really pushing through a tremendous amount of traffic over the air. And it does so not just by clever radio smarts, though it has plenty, but because it also uses this concept of aggregation, or essentially an aggregate of Wi-Fi packets is one very long Wi-Fi packet that includes a bunch of different IP packets inside it, or one Wi-Fi frame, to use the right term. These can be long. These can have 30, 60 packets inside there, and when they have so many packets inside there, they take a long time to transmit, a lot longer than a normal frame. If we step back and think about the idea of Wi-Fi being a contention-based or hub-based scheme, then we go back to this concept that when the air is free, when the last person who's transmitting or last device transmitting stops transmitting, that's when devices contend. The more transmission opportunities there are, the less the contention. With these aggregations, what it ends up doing is decreasing the amount of times things can contend, because if a data device like a laptop is streaming video or streaming data off the web and it's pushing through these very, very long, multiple milliseconds long frames, then these small little voice over IP packets, which are, large microseconds, but they're not milliseconds. These little tiny things have to wait for a very long thing to finish before they can go, and that just exacerbates the problem that I mentioned. And what that really shows you is the idea that even if you have WMM, and even when you do have the sorts of quality of service prioritization, because it's not strict prioritization, it's just some quality of service classes will do better than others. When you get a whole lot of data on 11N network, it actually puts a lot of pressure on the voice traffic and reduces the scale of voice traffic. So the whole idea of how you mix voice and data changes and becomes more critical for 11N than it is for 11 ABG.
So when you're using these large MPDU, the aggregated packets, how do vendors support voice to not use the MPDUs, and yet data can use the MPDUs simultaneously on the same network?
Well, in theory, you could imagine voice traffic aggregating as well, which, boy, if you could aggregate voice traffic, it would kind of solve this problem. The problem is that voice is a real-time protocol, meaning that when this packet goes out, you want to get it there before the next packet comes out. And if packets are going out every 20 milliseconds, there's a big risk for you to try to build up an aggregate. You can imagine, especially since voice packets are small, to meaningfully aggregate these things so that it reduces the over-the-air overhead, you would really want to pack together almost like a second's worth of traffic. And adding a second's worth of delay to a voice call is completely unacceptable. It would just sound atrocious, especially because that second is the wireless contribution. with IP packets. There's already contributions from the wireline side, from the handsets or the endpoints themselves. And if you're doing some sort of long-range call, like you're going from campus to campus or something, you really don't want to add to your delay budget any more than you have to. A second would be horrible. And of course, when you do aggregation like this, you're also changing the way that they get lost, which may be a good thing, may be a bad thing. But if you have enough there, you can increase the loss rates, and then loss rates on a voice call really cause the quality to plummet.
So I guess you're saying is supported to have MPDUs on and off by like access category?
Yes, it is possible to have aggregation turn on off by access category from the standards point of view. You will not usually see a device advertise that, or that a user will be able to configure that. And for voice, aggregation is essentially never going to happen anyway, because, as I said, you're getting packets every 20 milliseconds, and these packets have got to go out quickly. You can't afford to build up a long aggregate of it. So even though the standard technically allows for it, I would pretty much advise people that voice is not going to get aggregated, only data is.
Well, good. I appreciate your answers on that. If some of our listeners currently have a voice over IP over wireless running on their network, what are some metrics they can use to tell whether or not it's working correctly, other than just, obviously end users making complaints?
There's a standardized way to measure the quality of a voice call, or to define the quality of a voice call. And that definition, there's two flip sides of the same coin, essentially. One way you'll hear is called the mean opinion score, or MOS. This is a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being the absolute worst, 5 being unachievably good. But essentially, you expect these numbers to be in the ranges of 4. And in the book, there's a table that shows it. The concept here is that if it's 4, then the users are satisfied. In fact, they're very satisfied. If it's below 4, then some of the users are satisfied, and it continues falling down until nobody is. This originally was defined by surveying people. The way telephone companies would see how good the voice quality was is they'd actually get a bunch of people in a room, give them phones, and have them call each other, and ask them at the end, how did you feel about this on a scale of 1 to 5? Did you like the call? And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they would answer, and then you'd average them all together. Well, obviously in the electronic world, we're not going to do that, but they retain the numbering system. There's a similar numbering system called R-value, which actually maps, not linearly, but directly to the MOS score. Again, there's a table of this in my book. The idea here is that higher MOS score, like 90, it's on a 100-point scale, so 90 and above is really, really good, and so on and so forth. Basically, you want these numbers to be, for good quality voice, to be above 4 for MOS, or around 90 or above for R value. What that maps to is essentially what would be considered to be toll quality voice. It's voice you would pay for. It's what your landline, when you pick up your phone, is what you expect. It's not what you'd expect on your cellular phone, by the way. If you pick up a cell phone, you might get something lower than 4, and you're still paying for it, of course. But that's because it's assumed that the convenience is so good you'll want that. Surprisingly, in voice over Wi-Fi installations, and a lot of these mobile VoIP installations, you don't want to do cell phone quality, because cell phone is in some level of competition. You could choose to do nothing VoIP and just do cell phones and be fine. So the quality needs to be better. And in fact, usually the wireless phones are replacing landline phones, or other use cases such as just simply walking to the other person. You can picture in a hospital where they do a lot of voice over IP, they do nurse calls on these systems. And the opposite of a nurse call, their competition isn't a cell phone, it's the overhead page, which has high voice quality. You can always hear the other person when you do overhead page. The problem is that everyone else can hear it as well, and so it's a nuisance for the patients. Given that, you do want to find these voice qualities metrics of 4 and above. Now that begs the question, how do you in fact measure the voice quality? And there are a few different ways. One way is that devices themselves, a lot of these smarter voice over IP phones and smartphones with voice over IP integrated into them, can report back to you numbers like the R value or the MOS. And they do this precisely so you can help diagnose what's going on. Now, again, they're not listening to the call and saying, oh, this sounds really good. It's just following an algorithm that takes the amount of loss, packet loss, plus the amount of delay, combines it together and spits out a number. But again, you can look at these, and this will tell you with pretty good sense of accuracy whether 4.0 is being achieved or not. On the other hand, there are tools that sort of sit in the middle, where you have a sniffer or something, an access point, something is trying to determine or decipher what that MOS score might be. These are interesting in that they tell you, again, they'll give you a number. The problem is they're almost guaranteed to overestimate the voice quality somehow or another, simply because they can't see the entire end-to-end picture. They're always missing one piece. If you use a sniffer to look at packets over the air and count packet loss, then it may count a packet that the device never really sees, because the sniffer happens to see it, but the device doesn't. Either way, these are very useful things to have, and it's crucial to get a sense of voice quality testing. The last thing you can do is actually inject voice traffic into a network and then measure the quality directly. And this sort of automated voice injection is very similar to what I mentioned when you look at at these smartphones or a voice over Wi-Fi phone and look at the MOS score, except instead of using real phones, it's a synthetic voice call being injected. That also has a lot of value. And that really solves the problem of even having to wait for calls to know if your call quality is going to be good. If something injects the voice call for you, then it can tell you from that synthetic voice call whether your call quality is going well without you waiting for a user to complain or waiting for a user to even place a call that you have to run out and measure.
And you can be proactive. Another side of that same kind of question, the metrics that you mentioned, MOS scores and R values, work really well for the voice. How do you know that your wireless network is ready for voice?
That's an excellent question. That's a complicated question, actually. This depends on the type of wireless network you have and how you've deployed it. And depending on the wireless network that you've installed, and it's usually the type of architecture you're using, there may be a very big difference between a network that's ready for voice now and one that was simply built for data. One of the common things to keep in mind, especially if you have a lot of these networks where you have a lot of access points, is you want to make sure your coverage is good. And so there's a lot of measurements to do to ensure that coverage is good. Part of that is looking specifically at, you can do site surveys for certain vendors. For those who, if you've built a data network, you may have done something wrong with the coverage overlap. And so, especially for microcell-based systems, you want to walk around and make sure that the coverage overlap is much higher for voice so that you know that you're going to get reasonable handoff quality and things like that. Other things you want to look at are back on the wired side. So you may have a decent wireless network, or you may think that you're ready for voice. You've done the measurements. But what you may not have done is checked and make sure that you have the quality of service infrastructure on your wired side. Now, that you may say, oh, big deal, I have so much throughput on my wired side, I probably don't care. And you may be right. But you don't want to get into a situation where you're multiplexing your voice over IP traffic on the same link that you're basically doing nightly restores or backups for your laptops or for your servers, because those throw so much throughput through. You want to make sure you turn on the right quality service primitives there. And of course, they're different than wireless. They may use the same bits in the IP packet to differentiate the voice quality, or they may not. But if they do, you still have to set up rules, and it can actually be more complicated than a wireless system. So it's valuable to look there and make sure that your wireline side is also ready.
Good. Thank you for that information. And the last question we're going to have here is, as we're moving forward, and it's obviously towards the last chapters of your book as well, as we look forward towards fixed mobile convergence, how is that going to affect the wireless that we've been talking about, which is Wi-Fi based, as it also has to tie into cell phones?
Fixed mobile convergence is a very interesting application for wireless and broadly wireless, not just Wi-Fi wireless. The idea of fixed mobile convergence, of course, is that your cell phone is going to do all the work for you, meaning that your cell phone has the ability to do a call over the cellular network as well as over the Wi-Fi network. The value of it is pretty clear, that you can have one device rather than two devices. And for places beyond, say, limited areas like a hospital where maybe it's okay to give somebody a Wi-Fi only device, manufacturer may have the same thing. For a lot of these sort of carpeted enterprise applications, if you want to do voice over Wi-Fi, thinking of FMC is not a bad way to go. The interesting thing about FMC, of course, is that it's really still just getting started. And why I say that is two things. One, FMC, there are two flavors of it. There's enterprise-based FMC and carrier-based FMC. With enterprise-based FMC, meaning that you buy a box as an enterprise that routes the calls within your system. And once you buy that box that routes these calls, which is a good thing, it routes it all internally to the enterprise. The opposite one, though, is the carrier-based FMC, where all of the calls are routed through the carrier and you have no on-premises equipment besides your cell phone. Carrier-based FMC is there's a couple of carriers around the world who are offering it today, But the technology to do this ubiquitously is still coming. We're still waiting for some of this 4G technology to bring with it the voice over IP technology to do it from the carrier side. On the enterprise-based side, it is happening, but it's happening in places where there's a real strong need. It's not the sort of thing where everybody's going out and buying an FMC box today because they may want the future potential to buy voice. They're waiting to see what happens. I think that FMC is going to really help motivate having voice over your networks, and it's going to really help drive the requirements on wireless networks to support these sorts of mobile applications and to support these quality of service applications. It's just something that's really just starting to get going now.
So we're not quite ready? Is that what you're saying? Or just we're on the starting edge?
I would say, yeah, we're on the starting part. For those who really need it, for those people, those users who have a strong need for voice over Wi-Fi and the ability to take it outdoors with you, they're already looking at FMC solutions. For the rest of us who don't have that requirement, then FMC sounds like a very nice thing, but it's going to take its time coming.
Well, thank you for your time today and explaining some of the things. Your book is a great resource for anyone who wants not only to learn about Wi-Fi in general, but as well voice over IP in general. But then the whole reason for the book is that it ties all of them together with this mobility, scalability, deployment, the whole thing. So I appreciate your time today. Where might someone track you down if they wanted to contact you?
Probably the best way to get a hold of me now is to send an email at my work account. Since I work at Mario Networks, it's easy enough to find me at my first initial J, my last name, at marionetworks.com. The email will come right to me. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me, actually.
Well, good. We'll add that into the show notes. I appreciate your time, and we'll probably have to have you come back and talk a little bit about the difference between MCA and SCA, and I'm sure you have some definite ideas, and you can share some of that technology with us in the future.
Sure, I'd love to.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Keith.
Rant, pet peeve, what really bugs you? 60 seconds of complaining starts now.
Today's rant's on the whole Foursquare bit. I was addicted to Foursquare for a while. Every single time I got on a plane, got off a plane, went to a hotel, went to a restaurant, I was there checking in, making sure that I was getting credit for where I was, opening up badges, playing with all those things, thinking that this location tool was really a tool. And all I found out was, it's just a game. It's only a game. And if you want to treat it as a game, great. It's a fun little game to play, but it's not really going to be a tool of any value. That's my rant for the day. Well, thanks for listening all the way to the end of another episode of Wireless LAN Weekly. I definitely want to give our kudos out to Joe for spending the time not only once but twice to do a recording talking about his book. It's highly recommended on Scalable Voice over IP. Thanks for listening to the show today. We, again, look forward to your feedback and ideas on what you'd like to hear on Wireless LAN Weekly. Feel free to go on the website, look at the resources that are available to you there. And if you'd like to subscribe, we'll start sending out newsletters in September. So sign up for the newsletter and you'll be able to get a newsletter in your email box probably about once a month or so. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk with you next week.
Wireless LAN Weekly, a podcast focused on the needs of wireless LAN professionals. We look forward to your feedback. Please leave your comments at the bottom of the show notes, or email feedback on the show can be sent to feedback@wirelesslanprofessionals.com. If you'd like to leave a voicemail feedback, just call 24/7 and leave a message at 1-801-481-9018. Until next time, this has been another production of wirelesslanprofessionals.com, a place to educate, inform, entertain, and inspire.